Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 20th, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, I want to thank those of you who support the show by visiting patreon.com/talknerdy and pledging any amount for each and every episode. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because we rely so much on support from listeners just like you. This week's top patrons include Rob Schreck, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, David J.E. Smith, Dudas Infinitus, June Sapara, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. All right, let's talk about this week's episode. So I had the opportunity to sit down remotely, of course. Yeah, there's still a pandemic going on, with Adrienne Maree Brown. She's the writer in residence at the Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute, and she's written a bunch of really wonderful books. Her newest is called Holding Change: The Way of Emergent Strategy, Facilitation, and Mediation. We also talk about We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice. She has also written a book called Pleasure Activism, Shaping Change, and she's also the co-host of 3 different podcasts: How to Survive the End of the World, Octavia's Parables, and Emergent Strategy. And also, this is pretty cool, she's all about science fiction and has written quite a bit in that area as well. But today we're going to dive super deep into social and environmental justice, why that matters for science and science communication and representation in STEM, and so much more. So without any further ado, here she is, Adrienne Maree Brown. Well, Adrienne, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I would say this morning, but you're on the opposite coast, so I think it's just now noon for you.
Yes.
And I assume you've been doing a hell of a lot of press because you've been writing like crazy. You've had 2 books. By the time we finally worked out our ability to connect to talk about the first book, and it's not even the first book, but the first book that I got my hands on, you had already written a second book.
Yeah, I stay writing.
And so is that how you would kind of identify yourself, is as a writer first and foremost? Or, what would you say is your kind of main gig?
Yeah, I think it's taken me a long time to really land in it. That's just like, this is my primary work. And I do it in a dedication to justice, in a dedication to liberation, and to getting in right relationship with the planet and with each other. So I'm like, I think there's a lot of reasons why we do our work. And so for a long time, my work was facilitation, movement facilitation, particularly. And all along while I was doing that, I was also writing and writing and writing and writing and writing. And now I don't really do facilitation anymore in that way. I still do some support for people in movement work, but it's very personal, and I just write. Yeah.
Yeah. And tell me a little bit about what that means, facilitation, movement.
Mm-hmm.
I also
Mm-hmm.
read that you've done some work as a doula, that there's been like some very kind of, it's interesting because it covers the gamut, right? This very intersubjective, interpersonal, human to human work. And then this larger, still very humanistic and justice oriented work, but that reaches many more people, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I started out pretty young. Like I was in college when I was like, I have some kind of calling or some kind of capacity for helping people when we're in a group scenario to move through a conversation together, to move through conflict together, to vision together. And I learned that work was called facilitation, and it's facile, making it easy for people to be with each other, to be in conversation with each other. And, with the idea that it's hard being a human being, it's hard navigating community with each other, especially inside of the systems of capitalism and supremacy that we currently operate in. So a lot of my work is helping people, has been helping people land with each other, hear each other, feel each other, not have to be perfect, um, not have to even stick to one position, letting people get into a space where they could lose their boundaries a little bit and then regain the boundaries that they needed. So I did that for years, 20 plus years, 24 years. Um, and, um, and I love that work. I love watching a group come together that thinks it can't do anything together, that's like, we don't trust each other. We can't feel each other, and we keep doing the same things. We keep falling into the same problem areas, and being able to offer up some possibility by giving them the experience of each other in a different way. And I love that work. And the one of the books that you have, Holding Change, is really about everything I know about that work, right? Like I tried to put into a book everything I know about creating spaces where change can happen. Um, and and when I say movement, what I really mean is this complex system of movements of people who are in direct work for social change and environmental justice. And a lot of that work, people see it when it happens in public, right? So you see the Black Lives Matter movement, you see Me Too, you see Occupy Wall Street. You see these massive efforts to change capitalism or patriarchy or racism or things like this. My work was to support the people who are in those movements to figure out how to be together, how to vision together, how to create change together, and embody and practice that change themselves. And holding them and being held by them, being inspired by them, has been my adult life.
I love that so much, and I guess I really feel like I connect with that at a personal level because of my own sort of evolution in science communication. So, of course, you're joining me today on a science podcast, which might
Yes.
seem a little bit like a left turn, but it's absolutely not. I've worked for over a decade as a science communicator and scientist, but more recently, I have been working to finish my PhD in clinical psychology, and
Mm,
I take a very existential approach. I do a lot of end of life work, and this sort of I don't know the way that it's been culminating in my mind, which I haven't really fully been able to articulate, is that this movement towards scientific skepticism, this area of inquiry
hmm
and of
hmm
sort of activism I've always had, it's not just about the ideas, it's absolutely about the people and how the people live in the world and who the people are and what the cultural norms are that they bump up against and their sort of um uh, backgrounds and how do they work together. And science as a system still struggles with the same supremacist fundamental problems that our entire country struggles with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is, I think of humans as an unfinished experiment. We're still figuring out how to be. And I feel like we have all these different hypotheses on what it is to be a human and why are we doing this? Why are we on this planet? And those hypotheses are at odds with each other in ways that have quite violent results. And so, Holding Change is in the Emergent Strategy series. And Emergent Strategy was my dance with science, right? My recognition that there was this gorgeous world that we weren't necessarily paying attention to, but they were absolutely of, right? That we are of nature and that there's so much we can learn from the natural operating systems of the world about how we are and how we create change, right? Why do we need change? Why do we resist change? And then what are we learning all the time about change? And that part gets me really curious every time because we are often told things that will make us docile, that we can only do what's already been done, that we can only do what's already been established as like, this is the working way. And I think you spend time around children, you spend time around teenagers, and you quickly see, like, oh, that's not true. Um, Humans are always changing. We're always figuring out new ways to do things, new ways to communicate with each other. And so much of this period of my life, I'm an auntie, a proud auntie of a lot of nibblings who I'm watching them change the conditions of communication all the time. So every time I think I've got it, and I'm the cool aunt and I understand, how to stay in conversation, the whole mechanism changes. And the last time I was visiting with them, it was like, oh, now I'm playing games with someone while we're communicating, and our whole friendship is that we are gaming together, and all of our understanding of the world is through the lens of these games. I'm fascinated, you know. And I'm like, okay, well, we do love to play as humans. How could that be a part of our change making process? Um, and I approach that with both some degree of wanting it to be pleasurable and fun, and some degree of wanting to take it very seriously, because I do think we're right now in a particular battle for our place on the planet. You know, I've said before, I feel like we need to earn our place here, and um, like, we have this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful planet. There's nothing else that we've discovered anything close to like it. It's our home. And so a lot of my work is also that, like, how do we arouse people again about being human on Earth?
Oh gosh. Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that really struck me when you were just talking about spending time with your nieces and nephews is this idea that play is so fundamentally human, just as fundamentally human as some of the other core components of our relationships and of our kind of independent development. Yet we think of it as something that only children do. And I remember having a therapist many years ago, not a therapist who was training me, but a therapist, a personal therapist that I went to, and he used to always say, he likes to look at his clients' sort of profiles as within a context of there being three pillars of mental health: work, love, and play. And it's sort of like three legs of a stool. And if one of them gets knocked out, of course, you're very wobbly or you could fall. And the truth is that the vast majority of his patients were struggling with play. Like, they might be struggling with work and relationships, but they were putting all of their effort and energy into those two areas and forgetting
Hmm.
that play is even something that they should be prioritizing.
Yes, I think that piece is actually, one of the other books that I put out a few years ago is called Pleasure Activism. And a big component of that is that we're meant to be in pursuit of feeling good, and not in a casual way and not in a coping way, but very seriously, to understand what it is that brings us pleasure, brings us joy, and pleasure not just as a sexual marker of space and time, but pleasure. It's really in the spirit of Audre Lorde, who's a Black feminist writer, and she talked about the uses of the erotic as power. And she talks about painting a fence. She talks about being with her lover. She talks about writing a poem. And I think of all of these for me as things that emerge from the spirit of play. I try to build in structure into my lifetime that doesn't belong to others. It belongs to me. And it's unscheduled, unstructured time for me to figure out what it is I want to do. And I think of this as one of the great luxuries of my life. And one of the ways that I understand myself to be um, living into the space of freedom that my ancestors carved out, right? That I'm like, actually, from my lineage as an African American woman, the people who came before me were explicitly given no space for play, and they were only expected to labor, and there was no concept of their humanity beyond that. And I'm like, this is the way capitalism functions, is that in order for some to benefit and to reap reward, there are some who only labor. And now we've kind of gotten caught up in that being the only way of being that we value. I was reading something yesterday about how people who are wealthy work more hours than anyone else, even though the idea is that you get wealthy so that you don't have to work.
Right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's like, but because the value of being a worker is now taken precedent over almost everything else, that people don't play. Or if they do, they play hard and painful, in ways that they may not survive. So I'm really thinking a lot about what is healthy play. And, of course, there's an added component to that now because we have a whole generation of babies who are growing up and figuring out, how do we play in masks? How do we play at a distance? How do we play when the adults around us are not necessarily making decisions that ensure our safety? How do we play? You know, it's all connected, like this being a human thing. We're all figuring out the same things.
And you bring that you bring the COVID conversation front and center, at least and especially in "We Will Not Cancel Us." "We Will Not Cancel Us" and "Other Dreams of Transformative Justice," where you grapple with this concept of cancel culture, call out culture, and you bring it sort of very explicit. This idea of how we're existing in the time of COVID, how we're existing in this very artificial or intentional, maybe even, experience of living in a global pandemic. And so maybe we can take a step back because I want to talk about both of those topics, but maybe to just take a step back and I'm curious, why was cancel culture, or this idea, which will hopefully we can define and dig into, but why did this idea sort of inspire you to say, I want to grapple with this in a meaningful way and I
Hmm.
want to really write about it?
Hmm. Well, I think what happened, I wrote that book first as an essay. I wrote an essay called Unthinkable Thoughts. And it was in the wake of a sabbatical. Like, I had stepped offline and gone away, and during COVID, which was quite a strange experience. I was supposed to be having this deep rest and deep escape, and instead was like, oh, I'm quarantined in a tiny room, and grieving every day, and it's just a very different experience. And I finally took time off of social media, which for a while didn't even seem possible, right? It felt like COVID locked us all in even more deeply to what is happening on social media and how are we tracking everything that's happening, and we need to be so connected with each other.
Right,
So
because it
I
was
was
the
going
only way
to
we could
Yeah,
connect,
it
we
was like we
felt.
can't go
Yeah.
out. So
Yeah.
suddenly I was like, I'm at dance parties here, and I'm in circles here, and I'm in counseling, and like, everything is happening in these spaces. And I took a break. I was like, I need to be able with my own thoughts and my own pace. And I came back from that into what felt like a crisis. And the crisis was that almost every other message that was in my direct messages was asking for me to cancel this person, telling me how someone was harmful, telling me how someone was awful, evil, worse than that person, and basically disposable, asking me to in some way participate in disposing of this person. And I come from, I ran an organization, or I was part of an organization for 5 years called the Ruckus Society, which trained people in nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. And, calling out major corporations, showing up to shareholders' meetings with signs to shame those who are inside around decisions they had made. Like, that's something we do, I come from a community of people who, as Black people, as queer people, have had to use the method of calling out when there was a power differential that we could not otherwise cross, and we needed to be heard. And it's not something that I'm like against in theory, but what I saw was it being used as a lateral tool, as a lateral weapon. And that made me concerned because it was happening within spaces which are saying, we believe in abolition, right? We believe in abolishing the prison system and systems of punishment and policing that go along with it. We recognize that those systems of punishment have not actually ended the cycles of harm that they're supposedly exist to control. And we think that there are other options. We recognize that the system of prisons is rooted in the history of enslavement and the history of slave catching. And like all of that is tied up together, and it cannot actually be a just system. We believe in mediation. We believe in community accountability. We believe that there's a million other options that we need to get into practice of. So I'm like, these are communities who say that, but then are at the same time saying, but we have to get rid of each other. We don't want this person in our community anymore. We want to publicly humiliate and shame this person so that they will issue an apology, which we will then deride, and pick apart and not be satisfied by. And so the pattern, that rhythm of it, I was just like, something, this isn't what movement is supposed to feel like. I didn't feel that I was writing about the larger cultural practice of cancellation. Although, this is how books are, they go where they go. So I do think it still applies. A lot of it is like that desire to be better than others, that desire to be innocent, to establish that we are somehow innocent and that others are the ones who are guilty and bad and cause harm. It is rampant throughout our society. And after having a troll for a president for 4 years, I think that we kind of lost the reins of it. It's just everywhere. Everyone is yelling at each other. Everyone is wanting to punish each other. Everyone is wanting to establish that kind of moral dominance. And I was fascinated by it. And like the essay was called Unthinkable Thoughts because it really felt like I'm not allowed to even ask this question.
Right.
I'm not
Yeah.
allowed to say that maybe this isn't a liberation practice,
Or you'll
um,
get canceled
or
too.
I'll get canceled too.
Yeah.
And that was interesting to me too, as someone who, you know, the work of a facilitator is to be relatively neutral and trustworthy and likable, right? Like in some ways, I needed to not be a spark in the room. I needed to be part of the container. For years, I trained myself to do that, to really not have an opinion, but my opinion was never the most important opinion in the room to me. When I was facilitating, I was like, my job is to open the way for y'all to hear each other. And sometimes I disagreed with what was said, but what was important to me was the process. Now, in this case, I was saying, like, I know that y'all are going to disagree with me, and I still feel this needs to be said. And I kind of made a bet on my social capital in a way, that I was like, I think that enough people trust me that they'll hear this, even if everyone won't, and took a risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating idea, and I think it's a fundamental, I don't know if I want to call it a flaw of humanity, but it's definitely a low-hanging fruit um uh solution, problem solving strategy, that you get a lot of people together who are working towards affecting change and who have a sort of unifying message. And then what ends up happening, like you said, is that moral policing begins and people slowly but surely start to say, but because I disagree with you about X, I'm not sure if you're the right person to represent Y. And so let's move you out of this space. And then we'll move you out of this space and we'll continue to exclude and continue to exclude basically until we're back in our very own silos that we began in. This idea that I'm the only one who ultimately sees the world the way I see it. And if anybody else disagrees with me along all these different sort of intersectional ideas, then maybe they can't represent me. And it's such a funny cycle that we go through over and over. But the question is, how do we break this cycle, and how do we get to a place where we can split the difference, right? That we're not being inclusionary of people who are morally indefensible, of people who are promoting ideas and actions, even behaviors that are contrary to the very spirit of the social justice activism. But at the same time, be as open as we possibly can to accepting, all different views, so long as those views are not inherently or intrinsically harmful slash violent slash, it's like when we think about cancel culture, it's like, but there's a reason that, Harvey Weinstein was canceled and we shouldn't not cancel
Exactly.
him. So,
Exactly. Well, and I
yeah.
also think though that what we want to move towards, and this is the closest I've gotten to an answer so far around this, but I think what we want to move towards is a culture of accountability. And so we have a rape culture and we have a cancel culture and we have a culture of public shame and humiliation. But we don't actually have an accountability culture yet. And we are in this period in history blessed because there's more resources available than ever before for those who are interested in learning about this and who are interested in practicing other things. So Miriam Kaba and Shira Hassan put out this incredible book called Fumbling Towards Repair, which is a workbook on how to do community accountability processes. And Miriam also put out a book called We Do This Till We Free Us, which is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book about prison abolition that, because for me, it all ties together is we can't continue to function in a society where we're constantly trying to say who is worse than us as if it's the people rather than the behaviors. And, I think when you talk about something like a Harvey Weinstein, or for me, R. Kelly is often the example that I move towards, where it's like, it's not like people didn't try a million other methods before it got to the point of saying we have to mute him. Because as long as he has an audience that is actively investing in his lifestyle, there will be women who are being trapped in his basement. And so we have to cut it off economically. We have to try to support these women who a lot of them are too young. This is why statutory rape and why underage rape is so violent and dangerous, is because these are women who are not just being violated physically, but violated mentally. They're being violated. They're at such a young age, they cannot understand the emotional and mental danger that they're in, and they won't understand it for some time. They won't understand it often without intervention. And we see this in child sex abuser survivors, right? Is that a lot of times there's a commitment to or loyalty to or a desire to protect their abuser, not because they're not harmed, right? But because they're like, I love this person, or this is someone who matters to me.
It's so important that sorry to interject, but it's so important that you bring that out into the light. When I was working I worked in foster care for quite some time, like 2 years. And we were a group home setting. So these were these are adolescent girls between, I'd say, about 12 and 18. Some of them were lucky enough to get fostered and one even got adopted. But for the most part, these were girls who were struggling with the criminal justice system, who were struggling with like very, very intense abuse histories. And it was kind of just assumed until proven otherwise that that most of these girls were trafficked and were, kind of in that life. And one of the biggest things that I learned early on and had to really recontextualize my frame around was that they very rarely saw themselves as victims. They more often saw this as an informed choice. And like you said, this was like, no, I'm not, I just got to make money, or I really love him, he's taking care of me, or, it's not what you think. It's not like that. And it's completely understandable as an adult who practices even a modicum of empathy that somebody who's trying to survive is going to frame their narrative in a way that's empowering to them, right? That these are the things that I did in order to get where I had to be, and I'm not ashamed of them. And the idea that somebody else ultimately had control, or that somebody else had their thumb over me, is a very hard thing to realize when you're in it.
Well, and
Later
I think
on,
that
you
this
can
is one of
see
the
it.
reasons why I get so fascinated by all of it, is that people end up in these disempowering positions so much more frequently than we recognize. And it's easy to point at it, to even look at girls being trafficked and be like, oh, they are out of power. But I'm like, a lot of people who are in what appear to be consensual married relationships are equally out of power, right?
Yeah,
Are
yeah.
equally in danger emotionally, equally in danger physically, equally, trying to figure out how to keep their kids safe and themselves safe. At a certain point, you have to sort of step back and say, this isn't about individual choices or behaviors. This is about systemic changes. And that, the muting of one individual, the canceling of one individual after another, we can mitigate some harm. But to me, the true value of those moves is when we can uplift it to say the system that supports this being okay is no longer a valuable system, right? Whatever value it may have had, it's no longer one that we will allow to make money. It's no longer a system that we will allow to continue to function. If people behave in this way, they will lose their jobs and they will lose their reputations and they will lose things, right? So it's like all of that makes total sense to me. It makes total sense. And it feels like the moves that we make until we're in a situation where other forms of accountability are possible. And they are moves we make that don't say we are better than these people who cause harm to me, right? It's like, this kind of behavior can happen to a lot of people. It's the shape of, some survivors take the shape of a victim. Some survivors take the shape of perpetuator of harm. Most end up in both roles. And we can do a lot of harm without recognizing it for the sake of our survival. It's so much more complex than we let ourselves hold. And so what I was trying to do with that book was say, just, if we only look at those of us who are in movement and who say that we're abolitionists, what else is possible? Is there a way that we can do something that is not, our first reaction to each other is to try to dispose of each other? And what are the other options? And what I learned in the process of doing that work was that so many people want this conversation to happen. So I got overwhelming feedback from people who are like, this has happened to me. It's happening to me. It's happening in my organization. We don't know how to talk about it. We need this. And then I also got the feedback that was like, we need to make more distinctions about what we mean by harm, what we mean by abuse, what we mean by conflict, what we mean when we're talking about a contradiction. There's all these things that are getting collapsed and then responded to in the same way. So now someone might say we need to cancel this person, they've caused harm, and then when you actually get down under it, it's like we had conflict with each other and they were never accountable in it, or we never got to have the conversation we needed to have. No one in our community could hold it. And so they're just out here, and so I'm like, okay, that feels like a problem we can address. And as that my facilitator brain is always like, what's the thing we can actually do now? Because we can't do everything all at once. There's always I think there's always a right next move, a piece of work that is the work that will actually be able to like knock over the whole domino, So that's what that book is up to. And I'm really grateful that I wrote it when I did, because a lot has continued to unfold in that regard. And, the other piece that I talk about in there is this idea of discretion, of being able to train ourselves and remember that we can, just because we hear something, doesn't mean we can't investigate, doesn't mean we can't interrogate and make sure we understand the details. And that we shouldn't actually take major action that could transform someone's life or reputation if we don't have the capacity to do any of that interrogation. And,
Right.
like
Right. Not just jump to it based on the first piece of
yeah, it's
evidence
just like
that we
someone
get.
said this. And so I was like, well, that kind of behavior in the wild, I had so much community help me think through what the metaphors for this could be. But in the wild, it's that feeding frenzy behavior, right? There's no logic, there's no plan, and there's no empathy, there's no heart to it. It's just like it's time to destroy. And I'm like, what happens when we get in that state with each other?
Two things come up for me based on what we were just discussing. The first one takes me back to my time in foster care and this idea that you mentioned that some people who experience harm, then as they develop, recapitulate harm. They sort of some exist in a victim space, some exist in a perpetrator space, and usually it's some combination thereof. And I would see this so often with my girls that I was working with, where it was like the day they turned 18, they went from victim to criminal. And it was such a
Mm.
difficult experience watching somebody who was in the life go from being a victim to overnight being somebody who could be arrested for what she was doing. And historically, even an underage girl could be arrested. But here in LA, they've been doing at least some good work towards transforming the way that victims of sex trafficking are sort of contextualized within the justice system. Not great work, not where they need to be, but at least
Mhm,
some
mhm.
progressive movement. And you would see this all the time, that it was like the day a girl turned 18, as if anything actually is different cognitively, emotionally, developmentally. Nothing has changed. Yet the day she turns 18, she goes from being a victim to a perpetrator. And it was so frustrating to see that hard line that was written in the legal sand, which in no way is representative of the very, very fuzzy line of human development. So I
Well,
wanted
and
to
I
kind of,
think that
yeah.
that is such a, I mean, there's part of what we're dealing with is that we live in right now in a highly illogical world, right?
Mm-hmm,
So there's
mm-hmm.
so many things where, like, if you're moving from your heart, if you're operating with the idea that these are all human beings trying to figure out how to navigate massive systems that are structured around competitive, harmful ways of surviving, if you see the world that way, then it's easy to look at someone and however they have survived with some awe, some wonder, some curiosity, some empathy, some spaciousness to ask, how did you survive this far? And what do you need in order to survive further? And what would reduce the harm in your life? What would reduce the likelihood of you causing harm to others? Like, it's a totally different conversation that you can have. And if you don't view the world that way, if you view the world as looking for who individually can take on the blame of whole systems, then what you will see is a world full of evil people,
Right, right.
and you start to put everyone in that box that's other than you. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel that othering behavior, Octavia Butler, who's like my patron saint and someone who's really influenced a lot of my work, but she talked about that fatal flaw of humanity as hierarchy and intelligence, that we continuously use our intelligence to assert our hierarchy over each other and to find ways to then institutionalize that.
You're so
And
right.
that's,
Oh my gosh.
she like, to me, she laid it out so clearly. And I now, it's like, you can't unsee it,
Yeah,
So now all
yeah.
the time I'm like, oh, this is someone trying to assert dominance and, create a hierarchical system, whether it's male supremacy, white supremacy, ableist supremacy, wealthy supremacy. But it's like all these ways that people are trying to say, I'm better than you because this, I'm better than you because that. And it's killing us, and it's killing our relationship with the planet. I won't say it's killing the planet. I think the planet is remarkably resilient and, continuously shows us that she can recover from whatever's thrown at her. Though it takes time and not every other species gets to necessarily kick it here.
Yeah,
A lot are gone.
it's killing her carrying capacity for
her
us.
her
That's
her
really, yeah.
capacity, to be I think of it as like a relationship damage, right? That it's like when you support people who are in a relationship and trying to uh, find their way back to each other after trust has been breached, there's a way sometimes that you can exhaust someone's capacity to recover. And so rather than trying to recover with you, they might recover their capacity to trust, but you won't be a part of that circle. You won't get to receive that care. And I think that we're in that precarious zone with the planet now, where her recovery might mean that there's so many natural disasters that we can't function, that what we think of as a society is no longer possible. I think that that's what we're sort of barreling towards in this period. I had said a few years ago that things are not getting worse, they're getting uncovered.
Mm-hmm.
And now I feel like they're both and. It's like
Yeah,
things are
yeah.
getting uncovered and it's getting worse. And it's, I understand that it is particularly getting worse depending on how much privilege we have. Because again, the hierarchy piece is there. So, for some of us, it's so upsetting to be in the world right now, but we still get to stay at home and be as safe as we can while other people deliver things to us. And for other people, that's not an option. I have family members who are COVID nurses, and their livelihood depends on risking their lives every single day. And that changes how all of this feels.
Absolutely. Yeah. The point that you made about gosh, there's so many threads I wanna pull. The point that you made about, um, Octavia Butler's point about sort of like intelligence as an act of supremacy and as an act of control and stratification of people, stratification of groups, it really resonates with me as somebody who has studied psychology for decades and then my earliest degree, my undergrad, I did in '04, and then I went away from it and I got into hard sciences and neurobio and all these things. And now I've kind of come back to this more humanistic stance. But one of the things that always resonated with me early on, it was my psychometric work and really diving deep into the social architecture of intelligence testing and the eugenics movement and how all of this stuff sort of co-created, and that the framers of the earliest fascinating and really important statistical methodologies were also eugenicists who were at their core trying to prove the superiority of the white race and oftentimes of the male gender as well. And it's one of the things that I've struggled with so heavily within my role in psychom and scientific skepticism is that I often am surrounded by white men who have a logical positivist view that sort of like science is the way, it's the only epistemology, it's the best way to organize. And in many ways, I I feel that my foot is in that because I am a massive advocate for the scientific method. And I do think that it's the best way that we have figured out how to make sense of the world in the places where it's useful and in the places where it makes sense, right? Where it's relevant, where we can do science. But I believe that there are other epistemologies that hold, validity as well in areas where the scientific method is not reasonable to use. But beyond that, I think one of the things that I really, really struggle with is this sort of, I don't know, it's so hard for me to even put my finger on it. This idea that the very structure and system which we strive for, which is intellectual curiosity, which is always learning, which is bettering ourselves through knowledge, can also be an oppressive system of power. And I think that's very hard for a lot of people to understand because they see it almost like, no, this breaks the bonds of something that we were, that was hereditary or that we were passed down, that these structures of bondage that like we couldn't control, I myself learned, and that was freeing for me. And so because I put myself in a position to increase my knowledge, that was a works not grace situation. So I should be proud of that. And I should be able to stand on that. Like it feels very justified to say, no, my intellect is something I worked on and it's
But
mine.
I think the issue there, and I think what we run into over and over again with human
Hmm.
beings is that there's a place where the realm of science and the realm of reality, because I'm
Right.
also very much like, trust the science, like,
Yeah.
and not that science is reality. I think of it as the best we understand of a reality in a
Yeah.
given time period,
The
right? So
best
it's like,
system we have
this is
to
what we have
understand
figured
reality.
out so
Yeah.
far.
Yeah.
And, I don't necessarily feel like it's the best system, but I feel like it's the best common language, if that makes sense. So, for me, I think of it as I think of science as a sacred activity as well, and I feel like there's a way of letting the spiritual guide the science that is important and that gets left out, and because there's this idea that we're ever able to be objective, and I think that's
Right.
the really harmful piece is that it's like science done as if racism doesn't exist,
Yes, always.
science done as if patriarchy doesn't exist, then it's like, oh, there's a glitch in your experiment, but it's internal, it's within you. And so you can't even see that this glitch is there. You can't even understand how it's permeating all of the data that you are delivering or that you're processing. And that piece to me feels so important. And, bringing it back to this idea of cancellation or calling people out or whatever, it's like, instead of thinking that any of us have figured this out and that we can be the objective right voice or the right anything. I think so much more of this is like, how do we get into relationships where we can really wrestle with how complicated it is to be a human being, how rarely there is one clear right answer, how often we have to figure out what is the next right move rather than the total right move, and how often we have to do that in community. And those pieces feel so important to me that, like you were mentioning earlier, that if you keep pushing it so that it's like less and less people that can fit into your box of what is right, then we end up in these very tiny, isolated silos in which no one can understand each other. And I think of that biblical allegory, the Tower of Babel, right? This idea that it's like we can't actually build anything together if we can't understand each other. And now we have figured out ways to be all speaking some, common language that everyone's required to speak, but still not hearing each other because the versions of reality that we're playing inside of are so opposite each other. And that same thing happens, as a mediator. I often find that same thing happening at the very interpersonal level. So one person is like, this is an abusive, harmful situation. And I talk to someone else and they're like, this is a conflict where there was a real big misunderstanding, or that, it's just like a wildly different understanding of it. And it's only by sitting in the work that we're able to figure out like which thing is actually even happening here. And based on which thing is actually happening here, what is the necessary response? And it would be easier if it was just black and white. It would be easier if it was just, like for a long time, I was like, believe all survivors, and that's the way. But I'm like, well, and a lot of the people who cause harm are also survivors. And there's something we need to believe about their pain as well. There's something we need to at least be able to hear if we want the cycles of harm to end. And I always uplift Miriam Kaba on this because she talks about that. So the goal is to end the cycles of harm, not to be right, not to be superior, but to actually, get to a place where what it means to be a human is not to be in a state of causing and being caused harm. There's already suffering. Suffering is built into our experience. We don't need to add more to that.
Oh my gosh, Adrienne, there's so many things. Like I have a list of things I want to ask and things I want to follow up on, but I'm realizing that we're super short on time, and we always close the episode by asking our guests the same. By asking my guests the same two
like,
questions.
who else is here?
Right? It's like hiding on the line. And I know you've got to run, so if maybe we can keep them super short and sweet. But
Sure.
But at the end of every episode, I always ask these two kind of deep, sort of big picture questions. When you think about the future, in whatever context is relevant to you, you're obviously thinking through a lot of different frames. Number one, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night? That's worrying you the most? Where you've got maybe some even cynicism or pessimism. But then on the flip side of that, where are you genuinely, authentically optimistic and hopeful?
Well, the thing that definitely keeps me up at night is this relationship we have with the planet. And I feel like I can feel her. I feel like I feel the planet, and I feel her disappointment in us. I feel her longing for things to be right between us. So that keeps me up, is this feeling of squandering a miracle, and wanting us to love her the way she loves us. You know, uh, in her non-sentient, whatever, super sentient way. And then the thing that gives me solace and hope is being around children. I feel like children naturally love the earth. They know how to play. They know how to be with her. They are not scared of what she gives. And the storm comes and they're just like splash in the puddle. It's a different way of being. And I am blessed. I have lots of babies around me and around my life who inspire my writing and my thinking and my feeling. But yeah, they remind me that like everything is changing all the time, and that is the nature of the earth that we live on. And this is all evolution. And I don't think the U.S. as a nation will last, but I do hope the species will last. So that gives me some peace.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, the books are Holding Change, The Way of Emergent Strategy, Facilitation, and Mediation, as well as We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice, among others. Adrienne Maree Brown, thank you so much. It was just such a joy speaking with you today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it too. And I really appreciate your work and thinking.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.